Hi drawing students, this is a lecture on value. So we have dealt with line so far this semester, all the variations of line, and really dealing with the challenge of how do you best interpret the figure and draw the figure with just using line. So now we're going to move in to value, and the reason why we started with line was because we're working along this idea of working from general to specific. And when we were working with line, I was encouraging you to draw and really outline the shapes of value, and that was to help you to be prepared for this. So if you don't know the technical definition of a value drawing, I'm not gonna quote it word for word, but basically what a value drawing is the inclusion of tones feeding into other tones without the existence of line. So we've worked with line so far, and now we are going to do away with it for the most part, but we are going to still use it to help build the figure, the composition. We're still going to use those tools, the gesture, inciting, and we are going to generally give ourselves shapes of value. But eventually what we strive for is a fully rendered value drawing that has tones that fade into other tones without the existence of line. And the way those tones fade into other tones, the edges that they have, help better interpret the figure more realistically. So there are variations within the way those tones fade into or transition from tone to tone. So we're going to get into that. A few terms for value that you should know. Chiaroscuro is the use of deep variations and subtle gradations of light and dark to create the illusion of three-dimensional forms. It comes from the Italian word chiaro, meaning light, and scuro, meaning dark. So having both light and dark in the image, but having quite a drastic contrast, basically. The illusion of light and shadow in a two-dimensional illusion-based... What did I say? The use of light and shadow in a two-dimensional illusion-based image. Vermeer is really well known for using this technique. Deep variations and subtle gradations of light and dark to create the illusion of three-dimensional form. So we typically, in a chiaroscuro image, we have really deep dark backgrounds and bright highlights on the figure or on the subjects of the painting or the drawings, and it makes for a very dramatic feel. And then there is sfumato. Sfumato from Italian, meaning sfumare, or to tone down or to evaporate like smoke. And this is really soft edges, right? And we're going to talk about soft edge later in the lecture. Da Vinci, also Rembrandt is a good example of that, some of his later work. And many other artists throughout time as well. But that's what that sfumato word means. So we have those two different terms that you'll probably hear quite a bit used within and this term as well. Tenebrism, style of painting or drawing characterized by deep shadows and a distinct contrast between light and dark areas. The Latin word tenebrae, meaning darkness. It is a compositional technique in which some areas are kept completely black, allowing one or more areas to be strongly illuminated from a single light source. So Caravaggio is a really good example of that. So that chiaroscuro being the difference from chiaroscuro to tenebrism being chiaroscuro is talking more about the modeling of the form, as we saw up here with that Vermeer painting, modeling on the form itself, creating the illusion of three-dimensionality on the form, having both light and dark on the form, light transitioning to dark. And then tenebrism it's very similar and it can be kind of confusing. But tenebrism is talking more about the composition, and it typically is given to those paintings that have a really deep, dark, like black background, and one very strong light source, creating, again, this very dramatic feel. And Caravaggio being pretty famous for that style. And another thing to note here too, what you'll see in tenebrism that you might not see in chiaroscuro is that oftentimes the black tone of the background kind of fades into and seeps into the figure itself. So that will happen quite a bit. So, or into the object. So you see kind of the blackness of the background kind of creeping in and almost melding with the figures. So, value. This value scale should be very familiar to you. It's a 10-step value scale. And over time, hopefully you'll be able to see a tone somewhere and be able to label that tone on a 10-step value scale. There's also 12 steps as well, but I myself am more familiar with the 10-step one and being able to label or just kind of indicate what values are based on that 10-step scale. So understanding the full range of value can be helpful when the intent is to create a fully rendered drawing. So we do want, hopefully, all or most all of these values in your rendered drawing. There is a black square here, but it fades in with the black background of the slide. So with an additive drawing, with an additive value drawing, we're going to start with the white paper, and then we're going to gesture out our figure and use sighting and get the proportions correct, and then we'll put light, like a general value shapes, and hopefully leading to mid-gray, and then saving the darks for the darker shadows or the core shadows, and we'll go to this. So 6 divisions of light and shadow. Hopefully, again, this is review for you. We have 6 divisions in our light and shadow, and this does occur on everything, especially the figure. We have one highlight. We have number 1 is highlight, and that a lot of those occur all over the figure. And the highlight is where the light is hitting the object or the figure most directly. There's almost no darkness or no shadow involved, no gray necessarily. It is the brightest bright on the figure or on the object. Then we have light, where the light is hitting the object but not directly. So again, we have highlight where the light is hitting it most directly, light where the light is hitting but not directly, and then we have shadow where light is giving way to shadow, then core shadow, light has given fully away to the shadow, and this is the darkest part on the form, where we have fully transitioned over to shadow. And then we have reflected light, where light is bouncing off of other surfaces onto the form. And then underneath we have cast shadow, and this shadow, this division of light and shadow does not exist on the form itself. It is casted off of the form. It is the light that the object takes up. We also have down here part of the cast shadow, and it's not labeled here, called the occlusion shadow. And you may or may not ever see this when you're drawing the figure, but probably, or maybe, it is the darkest part of the cast shadow is where the form is touching another surface. So that occlusion shadow is normally it's very dark, very black, and sometimes very thin. So that is that occlusion shadow. Highlight, light, shadow, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. And it is very important that you are able to understand all of those divisions on the form, because they all do exist. I'm going to jump to this real quick and we'll go back, but I wanted to illustrate this on the form itself since I was just talking about that. I don't necessarily like how they have this labeled, but I like this image. So we have light. Highlight would probably be over here, and this is kind of a grainy image, but there's probably a really bright area over here somewhere. We have highlight here, light, where the light is hitting the object but not directly. Then we have shadow, where light is giving way to the shadow. It is darker than the light, but not as dark as the core shadow. Core shadow is the darkest part of the form. Light has given fully away to shadow here. Then we have reflected light, where light is bouncing into the shadow, right? But the area between the reflected light and the light is a core shadow. It is the darkest part of the form. What we don't have here is cast shadow, right? We don't see where the cast shadow is. Okay, let's go back. Identifying value structure. So the first thing you want to identify is where the light is coming from, the light source of the value. Directions and strengths of light sources contribute to variations of how the value can be interpreted. So it's important to know where the light source is, obviously to know where that bright highlight's going to be, and then the rest. Shape. You need to be able to identify the most dominant shapes of lights and darks to establish basic form and light source. Some people really struggle with identifying value shapes. And what might help us to maybe like blur your vision or something like that. But just to give an outline around the shape, a rough outline around the shape of the value is exactly how you want to start in a value drawing. Once you've identified that basic value shape, variation within shapes there, that next one. Once you've identified the basic value shapes, they can be subdivided further to address more nuanced value shifts. So we want to have a general idea of the value, give it yourself an outline of that, and you can go ahead and give it just a general initial layer of value, not too dark. And then you can start to layer media as necessary to interpret those 6 divisions of light and shadow, but really from core shadow down to reflected light is what you'd be concerned with in those value shapes, or shadow to reflected light. And then we have edge quality. Now, different edges of light and shadows may require different range of value shifts or values to be accurately conveyed. So we're going to talk about edge quality here in a second. So how we perceive the value of an object depends on its actual surface lightness or darkness, color, texture, lighting, as well as its surrounding values. So the actual value, what we call when we're addressing color, like local color, when we're talking about value, that would be local value, right? So if an object is generally darker than another object, or say we have the figure sitting on a white blanket, well, that white blanket is going to have a lighter local value than the figure, right? But then the way we interpret the value on the figure also is dependent on the surrounding objects. This means that the light mass will appear different on light objects compared to dark objects. The light mass of the same object may also appear different depending on its surrounding values. So as you can see here, we have a gray block, a black block, and a white block. And the way that we've addressed value with those three, or the painter has addressed value with those three, is different. And they've identified the numbers on the value scale. Well, okay, yeah, actually I see what they did. So for them, it looks like 10 is probably the lightest. Yep. So 10 is the lightest with this painter's. 10 is light and 1 is the darkest. So they've attributed value numbers to each one of these, saying that 10 minus 8 right here equals 2. And that's how they've attributed and figured out these numbers here. It's kind of an interesting study. So again, with local value, each of these, and we're going to look at a couple of these optical illusions, if you will, but this is a example of how the surrounding objects can make something look different, and you can use that to your advantage when drawing. So for instance, this gray rectangle is the same on this is a black rectangle here that you can't see the edges of because it's a black slide, but this gray rectangle is the same tone here and here, but here it looks much darker and here it looks much lighter. So the way that you can use it to your advantage is, say you need something to look darker or look lighter, but you don't really want to add more value or take away more value, or you can't. Well, then you could change the value of the surrounding things to make it look lighter or darker. Again, here A and B are the same value, but they look overall different. So A, they look different, and then we can see though that they are the same. Okay, so edge quality, as promised. We have several different edge qualities within value drawings, and remember, again, value drawing is where tones blend into other tones without the existence of line. Now we could very easily have a very soft edged drawing, right? Because we don't have anything, sharp transitions between value to differentiate between different objects or different surfaces. But the way that you treat an edge of a value shape is how you bring those forms together, or bring an outline, if you will, to that form, or lack of an outline. So hard edge is minimal to no transition or no transitional values. Higher contrast creates harder edges, basically. Soft edge, values placed next to each other with some transitional values between them. And then we have lost edge, where values placed next to each other with multiple transitional values and little contrast between them. So here's some examples of that, and again, this is that they've kind of labeled some different tone areas in here. The light, darkest dark being the core shadow, and half tones. So we have kind of number 5 on the grayscale, or which that really isn't, but half tones, so tones between, which would be the shadow, right? So between light and a core shadow. There's that image from before. And here's some examples of those edges. So we have a soft edge where there is a slow transition or slower transition, right, between light and shadow, or light and core shadow here. There is a very slight transition, but almost unrecognizable here. There's a darker area here than right here, and that's what's called the lost edge. So there's just the slightest transition, and we don't have a dark edge to that. Now, if we wanted, when we're first starting out the drawing, we could give this just a light little outline that we would then erase later, but that would just help differentiate that shape for us when drawing. And then we have a hard edge down here, where we've left this the white of the paper, or whatever tone this paper is, but then we've butted up this tone up to here, up to this edge, and there is just the slightest little sliver of reflected light there. And that is important to know, because we don't have just a harsh dark line here, right? And that's going to be very easy to do when we first do our value drawings, and that's okay if you leave that there. But a true fully rendered drawing does not have the existence of line, and the true three-dimensional form in space does not have a hard edge, right? There's just even the slightest little bit of reflected light there as well, but if anything, it is a hard edge but not a line. So some examples of this: Pierre-Paul Proudhon. This is a good example of this right here. Placing the highlights and core shadows next to each other in the interior of the form tends to look more volumetric and spatial. So this is something that would be great for you to do in class and in your homework assignment, is to have this very nice light side of the figure with a core shadow that butts up against the light of the figure, and then reflected light on the other side. And that really is how we get that volumetric feel in a drawing. And butting up that light against that core shadow really helps to bring volume to the form. Okay, so some examples of hard edges. Created by placing two tones of value next to each other with no transitional values between them. So tone next to tone, but still no line. Higher the contrast, the harder the edge quality. Higher contrast creates more emphasis, drawing the eye to that area. Some artist examples of high contrasted hard edges would be probably right in here, and the edges of the core shadow. But really along the edge here. Stephen Essel also has some line drawing mixed with the value. Hard edge right here, where we have this light background and this value of the figure here. Again, right here would be a very hard edge on the edge of the arm. Hard edges around the exterior of the figure here as well. Again, no line, but dark. This is Kent Bellows now. We have a very different value behind the figure here. So we have this value that then stops at the end of the arm, and around the figure, the value then stops, and we have the value of the background, and that's what's creating that hard edge there. I wanted to include some Robert Schultz. He kind of flips it a little bit. I think some of these have the gray. Oh no, this one's different, but he has the gray background and the white here. But he really emphasizes reflected light quite a bit. His core shadows are pretty light, and reflected light is really played up quite a bit in his drawings. So again, a lot of these edges that really, give way to the white of the paper with a hard edge here. But we also have soft transitions in his drawings as well, inside of the figure. So, as the same with the rest of the drawings we were looking at too. So we usually have both within each drawing, or all really. There's even here, there is every edge actually included. So we have actually lost edge right here, right, where it's so bright that the edge of the figure has given way. But we have hard edge right here, right, where there's pretty dark here, but then we have the background right next to it. We also have soft edges in the core shadows, right? but lost edges almost right here and some right here, and again right here. Soft edges or lost edges are created when values are placed next to each other with other multiple transitional values and little contrast between them. So we have value next to each other, but there's a lot of transitions between those two. So it makes for a very soft transition, right? Tend to look quieter or have a softer look. So these are some examples of that. We still have the hard edge around the outside of the figure here, but a lot of soft edges inside. So we don't have that high contrast in the core shadow like with the other images. And even here, the exterior of the form Tammy Beldew, we have some soft transitions on the outside of the form that gives that soft, almost blurry look. And a really good example of this would be Rembrandt's paintings. Two very soft edges in his work, especially some of his later self-portraits. And I know this is it's especially soft because it's blurry. But you can kind of see when you look up close that really the edges of his face are really blurred out, right? So edge quality, really important to think about. Okay, so in drawing in class and with your homework assignments, really anytime you're drawing you need to work general to specific. But I really want you to think about this when we're in class. You're going to start out by generally by getting the correct proportions of the figure, right? That's the main goal. We're going to start out with that, and then we're going to give a general layout of the largest value shapes. So we're going to get correct proportions, but then we're going to outline the value shapes in the figure, but the most basic, largest value shapes. But then we're going to subdivide those shapes. Once you've identified the basic shape divisions, begin to subdivide the larger shapes into smaller ones. So once you have that larger shapes identified, then you're going to look and see, okay, what transitions are happening inside of the general value shapes. And you will have the core shadow and reflected light in there. Note, not all highlights and shadows are the same. Make sure to consider what values would best represent each area based on color, value, light source, etc. And then the rest of this is student examples of some in-class work. And these first couple are that general to specific approach. So this would be exactly what the beginning stages of the value drawing should look like. And they've identified general value shapes around the figure, but they've left, this as reflected light, and they've given themselves an understanding of the general value shapes. And this even has a little bit more contrast than the first step necessarily, but you can see there's sighted lines here as well. You have some sight lines in here, but not too contrasted just yet. And we're just giving initial value shapes, but these two next ones would be a very good kind of first value step here. So we've just a very general idea of what that value shape is here and here. We just know that this is light and this is shadow. We know that we're going to subdivide that and get more detailed, but we have to start general to specific, because if you get too detailed too quickly, it will end up looking really contrasted where it shouldn't. And it's important that you're able to leave the halftones where they need to be. And you can also get very frustrated and result in a bad drawing because you didn't approach it correctly. Another example of that general to specific approach, this person has spent a little bit more time on line than we need for a value drawing necessarily, but it makes for a nice drawing. So they've given a general idea of light and shadow right? This is all almost the same value, except for they have started to identify that this is the core shadow. And then they're going to go in and divide even more. But very generally, we have light, and we will eventually give a little bit of tone where we need, where it's not highlight, right? We want to leave highlight as the white of the paper in additive drawing. We want to leave that white of the paper as the highlight in additive drawing, I should say. And then we want to develop the core shadow accordingly of how the planes are shifting in space. We want to develop and render that. And then we want to leave this as reflected light, which is going to be kind of a half tone, but it's definitely not going to be as dark as the core shadow. And I have made another demo for like a shorter demo on how to render with graphite pencils, and it's very short. It's 2 minutes long, and I want you to look at that and help that educate you on how to use those graphite pencils to render. And basically what you want to do, start with H pencils and layer in multiple directions of short strokes in multiple directions, and that will help you get that rendered volumetric quality with your graphite. Instead of just, we do not want one direction of graphite, we want to layer in multiple directions. We want to layer H up to B, and that will give us that volumetric feel. But here are some very a lot of different, just some different student examples of value drawings. And again, that demo I was talking about, that's specific to graphite pencils, not charcoal. Specific to using graphite for rendering, which is what we're going to be doing for a little bit of class and for your homework assignment. This is charcoal though, and so they've started to identify value shifts and render those accordingly. And just, yeah, a couple more examples, but they've kind of given, in this digital drawing, they've given some general idea of the value here. They have this nice detailed line drawing underneath, so we know that they've thought about all the value shifts, but they started with this general large value shape, and then they will go in and break it down even more if they have time. And I really love these last couple of examples, and I'd love, if we have the ability to do this, that you consider the entire environment. And this, you know, they've given this a really dark value shape, and it probably had that back there. So it kind of gives a little bit of tenebrism to the piece. But here's some really nice general value studies. And we could zoom way in and get very detailed if we wanted. A couple of gray paper studies, which I'm hoping that we'll get the time to do. I would argue that this is slightly too contrasted. So we could have left the gray of the paper quite a bit more than what we did here. So what resulted in was just this really jaggedy look and a very high contrasted image. Not as realistic as it could have been, although still a nice drawing. This, though, they've really paid attention to the halftones and really selectively used that white pencil and the black pencil. Use some interesting mark making in the background here as well, and in the drapery there. But we have more volumetric. We have a more volumetric feel here because we've left the gray of the paper more where necessary. Couple more gray paper studies, and I hope that we have the time to do those this semester. Again, considering the entire environment. And we do have all of the different edge qualities here as well. Hard edges, soft edges. Really love these drawings right here. A high emphasis. There's almost no line here. There is down here, but almost no line in the figure. And that's a really nice value study. And it's not that we can't have line in our value drawings. It's not that at all. It's really to kind of push you in the opposite direction of where we were with drawing line drawings. So I want to try and like challenge you as much as I can in the other direction. Really nice gray paper study right here. Really selectively using again that white and that black pencil, the white and the dark pencils, so that we have that half tone as much as needed. And a couple more of these value studies with the whole environment, and these are kind of more chiaroscuro, darker pieces, sometimes some tenebrism in there. I think this is the last one. This is a really, really nice study. We can see where they thought very generally about the value shapes here, and that it's likely how this started in the figure. What's really nice right here, they've left this reflected light right here on this side. This core shadow is developed really nicely, and then we have light and highlight here. And they've likely, for you digital people, they've likely zoomed in and done a lot of detail work, which really helps to realistically give a more realistic feel to the form. So that is value. Oh, another one. Nope, that was my last one. So this is value. Again, very nice. I think that these are the same artists. If I had to guess, these are the same artists. Again, thinking about the entire environment and all of the value shifts in and outside of the figure, thinking about the different edges, identifying value shapes, and then subdividing those value shapes. Working very general to specific is our goal. So in class, we want to start with something like this or like this. That's how we want to start. And we want to build out the environment as well, and the things that the figure is sitting on or is touching. And we want to start with our values, something like this, and then subdivide and bring more contrast after that. All right. Thanks, guys, and that is value.